Chapter 15. The Final Legacy. 10 years after the transformation, Briar received a letter that changed everything. It arrived not by messenger but by magic, a technique the Genesis Academy had developed, allowing instantaneous communication across vast distances. The envelope shimmered with layers of light and shadow, sealed with a mark she recognized immediately. Cashin's mark, the keeper of the original separation. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Genesis Queen, I have watched your kingdom for 10 years. Watch it stumble and adapt, fracture and heal, fail and try again. I confess, I expected collapse within 2 years. Expected the Genesis stone fragments to destabilize, the transformed beings to turn on each other, the pure bloodline citizens to revolt and reclaim traditional order. None of that happened. Oh, there were crises, the burning summer riots, the pure heritage movement, the Genesis sickness outbreak. But each crisis was met not with return to separation, but with negotiation, adaptation, evolution. I was wrong. Those 3 words are difficult for a being who has existed since before the Great Severing. I have spent millennia believing that bloodline separation was the only way to prevent apocalyptic destruction. That mixing was inherently unstable and would inevitably lead to catastrophe. But you have proven that forced separation creates its own catastrophes. That voluntary evolution, while chaotic and messy, is sustainable in ways mandatory purity never was. I write to you now for 2 reasons. First, to offer what I should have offered 10 years ago, the complete archives of the First Council. Every record of previous attempts at unity, every failure analysis, every lesson learned through bloodshed and ash. You've been navigating blindly, learning through trial and error what you could have learned through study. That was my pride, my fear, my failure. I offer this knowledge now without restriction. Second, to warn you, you are not alone. Across the continent, 8 other kingdoms have begun spontaneous Genesis manifestations. Children working with abilities that cross bloodline boundaries. Adults transform without ceremony or choice. The separation I helped create 10,000 years ago is failing everywhere simultaneously. Some kingdoms are responding with your model, cautious acceptance, voluntary transformation programs, plural unity frameworks. Others are responding with violence, executing manifestos, enforcing bloodline purity through brutal suppression, attempting to recreate the original separation through darker magics than the First Council ever employed. A war is coming, not between kingdoms as they exist, but between philosophies of what kingdoms should become. Between those who see Genesis manifestation as evolution and those who see it as extinction. You created the first successful Genesis society. That makes Silver Peak both a beacon of hope and a primary target for those who believe transformation is corruption. Prepare yourself, Queen Briar. The bridge you built is about to be tested on a scale you never anticipated. With respect and apology, Cashin, Last Keeper. Briar read the letter 3 times before calling an emergency council meeting. The council chamber had evolved significantly over 10 years. Where once there had been clear divisions between transformed and pure bloodline sections, now the seating was mixed, Genesis beings sitting beside unchanged wolves, shadow-touched representatives beside Lightcasters, all united under Silver Peak's plural banner. But the ease of that integration was about to be tested. War, Malwick said flatly when Briar finished reading Cashin's letter aloud. The Keeper is predicting war. Not predicting, Elder Morphia corrected. She was over a century old now, her ancient body showing the strain even as her mind remained sharp. Warning, there's a difference. What's the difference if the result is the same? Counselor Brennan asked, still pure bloodline wolf after all these years, but respected for his pragmatic approach to plural unity. We need to prepare for conflict regardless of whether it's prediction or warning. The difference is intent, Vesper said. Now 26 and serving as the Genesis Academy's headmaster, she'd grown into leadership naturally. Cashin isn't trying to frighten us. They're trying to help us survive. By telling us we're about to become a battlefield? Ronan challenged. He remained in Silver Peak after the Waste's visit, eventually joining the diplomatic corps. Some help. They're offering the first council archives, Briar interjected. Complete knowledge of every previous attempt at bloodline unification. Every failure, every success, every lesson learned through 10,000 years of experimentation. Knowledge won't stop armies, Darius said. As captain of the guard for a decade, he'd become an expert at translating idealistic goals into practical security measures. If kingdoms are executing Genesis manifestos and Silver Peak represents everything they fear, we'll be attacked. Knowledge might help us understand why, but it won't prevent it. Then what will happen? Jax asked. At 24, he'd become one of the kingdom's most powerful Genesis warriors and one of its strongest voices for pacifism. Do we prepare for war? Become the militant Genesis state they fear we are? We prepare for defense, Kael said carefully. There's a difference between readiness and aggression. Is there? Marcus challenged. His hair had gone silver over the decade, making him look more father than Shadow King. In my experience, the line between defense and aggression becomes blurry once blood is spilled. Briar listened to the debate spiral, feeling the weight of a decision she'd hoped never to make. For 10 years, Silver Peak had existed in relative peace. Complicated peace, negotiated peace, but peace nonetheless. Now that peace was ending, and she had to decide how they would meet what came next. We prepare on 3 fronts, she said finally, her voice cutting through the arguments. Military, diplomatic, and educational. She stood, moving to the large map of the continent that dominated one wall. Military. Darius, I want our defenses reinforced but not expanded. We protect our borders, but don't project force beyond them. We become a fortress, not an empire. Diplomatic. Ronan, I need you to reach out to every kingdom Kashan mentioned. Offer support to those attempting Genesis integration. Offer asylum to manifestors in kingdoms that are executing them. Make it clear we're not trying to convert anyone, just providing alternatives to violence. Educational. Vesper, the Genesis Academy needs to prepare for an influx of students, possibly refugees, from across the continent. We might become the only safe place for Genesis manifestors. We need capacity for that. She turned to face the council. But most importantly, we need to reach out to the kingdoms that are responding with violence. Not to attack them, but to understand them. To ask what they're afraid of and address those fears honestly. You want to negotiate with people who are executing children? Brennan asked incredulously. I want to prevent a war that will kill thousands of children, Briar corrected. And if that means sitting down with people who terrify me, listening to arguments that disgust me, and finding common ground with those I fundamentally disagree with, then yes. That's exactly what I want to do. That's naive, Malwick said, but his tone was gentle rather than condemning. Some people can't be negotiated with. Maybe, Briar agreed. But I have to try. Because the alternative is becoming the thing we fought against for 10 years. People who decide others are too different, too dangerous, too wrong to coexist with. Silence as the council processed this. I'll support military preparation, Darius said finally. But I agree we should exhaust diplomatic options first. I'll begin outreach immediately, Ronan added. Though I'm not optimistic about response rates. The Academy can handle increased capacity, Vesper said. We've been preparing for expansion anyway. One by one, the council members committed to their roles in preparation, though uncertainty hung heavy over them all. As the meeting dispersed, Kael caught Briar's arm. You know this might not work. Diplomacy, I mean. Some kingdoms might see any outreach as a threat. I know, Briar said. But I have to try. For the same reason I chose transformation 10 years ago, because refusing to try guarantees failure, while trying at least offers possibility. That night, Briar stood in the archives where Kashan's knowledge had materialized, thousands of documents spanning 10 millennia, each one detailing attempts at bloodline unification and why they'd failed. She pulled a random scroll, reading about the Kingdom of Radiant Horizons, a civilization that had lasted 8 years before Genesis' stone failure triggered an explosion that eliminated everything within 300 miles. Another scroll described the Twilight Confederacy, 7 kingdoms that had unified under Genesis principles, thrived for a generation, then collapsed into civil war when second-generation manifestos developed abilities no one knew how to control or contain. A third detailed the Harmony Empire. Mandatory transformation enforced through conquest, maintained through brutal suppression of dissent, eventually destroyed by internal revolt when those forced to transform turned their Genesis abilities against their oppressors. Failure after failure, each one different but sharing common threads, forced unity collapsed under its own weight. Voluntary unity was fragile against external pressure, and every society underestimated the complexity of sustaining transformation across generations. Discouraging reading? Elder Morphia asked, appearing in the archives with her characteristic silent grace. Terrifying, Briar admitted. Every attempt failed. Every single one. We've lasted 10 years, which makes us successful by historical standards, but these documents suggest we're just delaying inevitable collapse. Or, Morphia said, settling into a chair with a sigh that betrayed her years, we're learning from their failures. Look at what they all have in common. They treated Genesis transformation as a solution rather than a starting point. They believed that achieving unity meant the hard work was over, when actually it was just beginning. She gestured to the scrolls scattered across Briar's desk. We've survived 10 years not because we perfected unity, but because we accepted that unity would never be perfected, that it would always require active maintenance, constant negotiation, eternal vigilance against the comfortable illusion that we'd arrived at our destination rather than continuing to journey. But war changes everything, Briar said. These kingdoms that are executing manifestors, they're not going to be convinced by philosophy. They're afraid, and fear makes people dangerous. Fear makes everyone dangerous, Morphia corrected, including us. The question is whether we let that danger drive us toward violence or toward understanding. You sound like you're advocating for pacifism in the face of aggression. I'm advocating for not becoming what we're fighting against. Morphia's ancient eyes held wisdom that came from witnessing centuries of cyclical violence. The kingdoms that are executing Genesis manifestos believe they're protecting their people from existential threat. They're wrong, but they're sincere. If we respond to their violence with violence, we confirm their fears. We become the dangerous Genesis state they warn their people about. So, we just accept being attacked. We defend ourselves, Morphia clarified. But we don't retaliate beyond defense. We don't invade, don't conquer, don't attempt to force our model on kingdoms that reject it. We remain the alternative, visible, accessible, thriving, and we trust that over time, people will choose possibility over fear. That's asking a lot, Briar said. Trusting that truth will prevail while people are dying. Yes, Morphia agreed. It is. But the alternative is becoming the empire these archives warn against. And I think you'd rather die defending what we've built than live having destroyed it to save it. Briar looked at the ancient woman who'd guided her through 10 years of impossible decisions. Were you always this wise? Or does wisdom just come from living long enough to see everything fail spectacularly? Morphia laughed, a sound like wind through ancient trees. Both. And neither. Mostly, wisdom is just accumulated mistakes dressed up in prettier language. Over the following weeks, preparation intensified on all fronts. Darius reinforced the kingdom's defenses, training both Genesis warriors and traditional fighters in coordinated defense strategies. The goal wasn't to create an invincible army, but to make Silver Peak expensive enough to attack that kingdoms would seek diplomatic solutions instead. Ronan reached out to neighboring kingdoms, offering support and resources. 3 kingdoms requested advisors to help navigate their own Genesis manifestations. 2 more requested asylum programs for manifestors they couldn't protect domestically. 1 kingdom, the Eastern Sovereignty, responded with threats, declaring that any Genesis being who crossed their borders would be executed on sight. Vesper expanded the Genesis Academy, creating space for 500 additional students. Within a month, the first refugees arrived, children and teenagers fleeing kingdoms where their abilities had marked them for death. Each refugee brought stories of increasing violence. Manifestors hunted, families torn apart, communities fractured by fear and propaganda, painting Genesis abilities as demonic corruption. And through it all, Kashin's archives revealed the pattern. Societies under stress always sought scapegoats, and those who were different always became the easiest targets. 6 months after Kashin's warning letter, the first attack came. Not military invasion, but something more insidious. Coordinated raids on border villages by pure heritage extremists, a transnational movement dedicated to eliminating Genesis manifestos and anyone who supported them. They struck 3 villages simultaneously, killing 12 people, 8 Genesis beings and 4 pure bloodline citizens who defended them. Briar stood in the ruins of the 3rd village, looking at bodies that had been burned beyond recognition, and felt something inside her break. "They're sending a message," Darius said, his face grim. "That nowhere in Silver Peak is safe for Genesis beings. That even we can't protect those we've promised sanctuary." "Then we send a message back," Malwick said, his diplomatic demeanor replaced by warrior rage. "We hunt down these pure heritage fanatics and confirm every fear they're spreading about us." Briar interrupted. "That Genesis beings are violent, dangerous, will stop at nothing to spread their corruption." "So, we do nothing?" Malwick challenged. "Let them kill us and call it restraint." "We defend," Briar said. "We investigate, identify those responsible, and we prosecute through proper diplomatic channels. We don't become the monsters they claim we are. Even if that means more people die while we're taking the moral high ground." Briar looked at the burned bodies, at the families weeping over what remained, at the message written in blood and ash. "Yes," she said finally. "Even then. Because the moment we abandon our principles to fight our enemies, we've already lost everything we claimed to be protecting." It was the hardest decision she'd made in 10 years. It wouldn't be the last. The war Kashin had warned about was beginning, and Silver Peak would have to decide whether to fight it with violence or with a stubborn, costly, agonizing commitment to remaining what they'd always claimed to be. A bridge. Not a fortress. Not an empire. Just a bridge, holding steady while the world decided whether to cross it or burn it down. Chapter 16. The Cost of Principles. The council chamber felt smaller than usual, despite being the same size it had always been. Perhaps it was the weight of grief pressing down on everyone present. Or perhaps it was the absence of the 12 people who should have been alive, attending this meeting, contributing to the conversation about their own safety. Briar stood before the council, dark circles under her eyes from 3 sleepless nights. Behind her, a wall displayed the names and faces of those killed in the Pure Heritage raids. "The perpetrators have been identified," Ronan reported, his diplomatic composure cracking at the edges. 17 individuals from 4 different kingdoms, coordinated through encrypted communications we've only partially decoded. The Eastern Sovereignty denies official involvement, but refuses to extradite the 3 attackers who fled back across their borders. "Of course they refuse," Brennan said bitterly. "Why would they hand over people they probably funded in the first place?" "We don't have evidence of government funding," Ronan corrected carefully. "We have common sense," Malwick countered. These raids were too coordinated, too well-equipped to be random extremists. Someone with resources is backing Pure Heritage, even if they're smart enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Which brings us to the central question," Kael said, his alpha presence commanding attention. "How do we respond?" The room fell silent, everyone waiting for Briar to speak. She'd spent 3 days wrestling with this decision. 3 days reading Kashin's archives about kingdoms that had responded to violence with violence and kingdoms that had practiced restraint. The archives offered no clear answers. Both approaches had led to destruction, just through different paths. "We respond with justice, not vengeance," Briar said finally. "The 14 attackers we captured will be tried under Silver Peak law. Publicly, transparently, with every detail documented, so no one can claim we executed them in secret or treated them as anything other than criminals." "And the 3 who escaped to Eastern Sovereignty?" Darius asked. "We continue diplomatic pressure for extradition. We make it clear that harboring them is tantamount to endorsing terrorism. But we don't invade, don't send covert forces across borders, Don't escalate beyond diplomatic channels. That's not justice, a voice called from the gallery, one of the villagers who'd lost family in the attacks. That's letting them get away with murder. Briar turned to face the grieving families who'd been invited to observe the council session. You're right. It's inadequate justice. Incomplete justice. But it's the justice we can pursue without abandoning our principles. Principles don't bring back the dead, another villager said, her voice breaking. No, Briar agreed softly. They don't. Nothing brings back the dead. But principles determine how many more people die after them. And I won't sacrifice what makes us different from our enemies just to satisfy the understandable desire for revenge. This isn't about revenge, the first villager insisted. It's about safety. You're saying our safety matters less than your philosophical purity. The accusation hit Briar like a physical blow because it contained truth. She was prioritizing principles over immediate security, choosing long-term integrity over short-term satisfaction. I'm saying, Briar responded carefully, that your safety and our principles are connected. If we respond to pure heritage with the violence they're trying to provoke, we confirm every propaganda point they've made about Genesis beings. We prove to uncertain kingdoms that we are the threat they were warned about. And suddenly, instead of a few hundred extremists, we're facing coordinated opposition from multiple governments. She gestured to the map behind her, where red markers indicated kingdoms with active pure heritage cells. Right now, most kingdoms are neutral, disturbed by the attacks but not ready to openly support them. If we retaliate militarily, that neutrality evaporates. We become the aggressors. And then your safety, everyone's safety, becomes impossible to maintain. So we're hostages to other kingdoms' opinions, Malwick said, letting fear of what they might think dictate our response to actual violence. We're participants in a larger political reality, Briar corrected. Like it or not, Silver Peak doesn't exist in isolation. Our actions have consequences beyond our borders. And right now, Pure Heritage is trying to engineer a specific consequence. They want us to overreact, to prove we're the dangerous Genesis state they've been warning about. Maybe we should be dangerous, Jax said quietly. At 24, he'd matured into a formidable warrior, and the violence of the raids had awakened something fierce in him. Maybe being principled has made us appear weak. Maybe if we showed the kind of power Genesis abilities actually represent, these attacks would stop. Or accelerate, Elder Morphia countered. Fear drives people to desperate measures. If we demonstrate that Genesis beings are as powerful and dangerous as Pure Heritage claims, we don't deter attacks, we justify them. We prove that suppression was the correct response all along. The debate continued for hours, the council splitting along predictable lines. Those who'd transformed tended toward restraint, worried about confirming fears about Genesis abilities. Pure Bloodline members leaned toward stronger response, arguing that restraint was being interpreted as weakness. And the grieving families in the gallery simply wanted someone to pay for what had been taken from them. Finally, as evening shadows stretched across the chamber, Vesper stood. She'd been silent throughout the debate, her face unreadable. I was in the third village when the attack happened, she said quietly. I was visiting the Genesis Academy's satellite campus. I heard the explosions, smelled the fire, ran toward danger instead of away because that's what you do when you're trained to help. Her voice remained steady despite the trauma evident in her eyes. I found a girl, maybe 9 years old, trapped under burning debris. Her mother was already dead beside her. I pulled her out, healed what I could, but she died in my arms. Her last words were, "I'm sorry." She apologized for manifesting Genesis abilities. Apologized for being the reason her mother was killed. Apologized for existing. The chamber was absolutely silent. I've spent 3 days thinking about that apology, Vesper continued. About a 9-year-old child who believed her existence was something to apologize for. And I realized something. Pure Heritage has already won, if that's the message Genesis children are receiving. That their burdens, problems, threats that need to be managed with careful diplomatic restraint. She turned to Briar. You're right that we shouldn't retaliate with violence. You're right that we need to maintain our principles. But we also need to send a message to every Genesis child in Silver Peak and beyond that their lives have value. That we will protect them, not just diplomatically or eventually or through proper channels, but immediately and fiercely, and without apology. What are you suggesting? Briar asked. I'm suggesting we do both, Vesper said. We try the attackers we captured. We pursue diplomatic channels for those who escaped. But we also demonstrate power. Not through violence, but through protection. We create a Genesis Guard, warriors specifically trained to defend manifestors and respond immediately to threats. We make it clear that while we won't invade other kingdoms, we absolutely will defend our own with everything Genesis abilities make possible. That's still showing force, Malwick observed. Defensive force, Vesper clarified. There's a difference between demonstrating capability to attack and demonstrating capability to protect. Pure Heritage wants us to look dangerous. Let's look dangerous only to those who threaten our people. The suggestion hung in the air, neither pure restraint nor pure aggression, but something in between. It could work, Darius said slowly. A highly visible defense force, trained specifically in protection rather than offense. It shows strength without proving Pure Heritage's propaganda right. It also gives Genesis youth something to aspire to, Jax added. Right now, we're teaching them to hide their abilities, to be careful, to apologize for existing just like that 9-year-old did. A Genesis Guard says the opposite, that their abilities are valuable, worth developing, worth defending. Briar looked around the chamber, seeing the shift in energy. The grieving families in the gallery looked less defeated. The council members looked less divided. Even the pure bloodline representatives seemed to find the compromise acceptable. We'll need rules of engagement, Kael said. Clear guidelines about when and how the Genesis Guard can act. We can't have them deciding independently to cross borders or escalate situations. Agreed, Vesper said. Strict protocols, heavy oversight, and they operate only within Silver Peak's borders unless specifically requested by other kingdoms' Genesis protection programs. How quickly can we establish this force? Briar asked. 2 months for initial training, another month for deployment, Darius estimated. We already have Genesis warriors with combat training. We just need to shift focus from general defense to specific protection protocols. Then we proceed, Briar decided. The 14 captured attackers receive full trials starting immediately. Diplomatic pressure continues for the 3 who escaped. And we establish the Genesis Guard with the understanding that they're protectors, not soldiers. Defense, not offense. Always. The council voted, and the measure passed with surprising unanimity. As the meeting dispersed, the villager who'd first challenged Briar approached hesitantly. Your Majesty, I'm sorry I said principles don't matter. I was angry. I'm still angry. But I see what you're trying to do. Keeping us safe without becoming the monsters they claim we are. Your anger is justified, Briar said gently. And I'm sorry my principles made your grief more complicated. You deserved immediate justice, and I couldn't give it to you. Maybe, the woman said. But maybe that 9-year-old Vesper mentioned. Maybe she's watching from wherever the dead watch from. And maybe she's glad that her death didn't turn us into the kind of people who killed her mother. She left before Briar could respond, leaving her alone with Kael in the emptying chamber. You made the right call, Kael said, pulling her close. Did I? Briar asked. 12 people are dead. 3 of their killers escaped justice. And I chose abstract principles over concrete revenge. How is that right? Because consequences matter, Kael said. Not just immediate consequences, but ripples extending forward through time. You're thinking about the Genesis children born 5 years from now, 10 years from now, growing up in a kingdom that responded to violence with measured justice instead of reflexive retaliation. That's not abstract. That's their lived reality. It doesn't bring back the 12 who died. No, Kael agreed. It doesn't. And that's the weight you'll carry. But carrying that weight, choosing to absorb that pain rather than spreading it through violence, that's what makes you different from Pure Heritage. That's what makes Silver Peak worth defending. Briar leaned into her mate's solid warmth, feeling the exhaustion of 3 sleepless nights catching up to her. The trials start tomorrow, she said. Public, transparent, documented. The attackers will have proper legal representation. Everything will be done correctly, even knowing it won't satisfy everyone. Especially knowing it won't satisfy everyone, Kael corrected. That's what makes it just rather than merely satisfying. That night, Briar stood in the memorial garden where the 12 victims had been honored. 12 new stones, 12 names, 12 lives that should have continued. She touched each stone, speaking their names aloud, promising them that their deaths would not be weaponized, would not be used to justify becoming what their killers claimed Genesis beings were. It was a promise that felt inadequate even as she made it. But inadequate promises were all she had. Principles demanded sacrifice. Justice requires patience. And leadership meant carrying the weight of decisions that would never feel entirely right. Tomorrow, the trials will begin. Next month, the Genesis Guard would form. And somewhere beyond Silver Peak's borders, Pure Heritage was already planning their next attack, their next message, their next attempt to provoke the violent response that would justify their existence. The war was escalating, and Silver Peak would have to keep choosing the harder path: justice over revenge, protection over aggression, principles over satisfaction. Not because it felt good, but because it was right. And right mattered, especially when it cost everything. Chapter 17. The Trials and the Storm. The courtroom had been constructed specifically for these proceedings, large enough to accommodate the hundreds who wanted to witness justice, transparent enough that every moment could be documented and broadcast across the continent. Briar sat in the observation gallery beside Kael, watching as the first of 14 attackers was brought in. His name was Corvin Ashright, 23 years old, from Eastern Sovereignty. He'd confessed to setting the fires that killed 4 people in the second village. He showed no remorse. "I'd do it again," Corvin said when asked if he understood the charges. "Genesis corruption is a plague. I was trying to cure it." The courtroom erupted. Guards had to restore order 3 times before the prosecutor could continue. Briar watched it all, with a sick feeling in her stomach. This was necessary, showing that Silver Peak operated under law rather than mob justice, but it was also agonizing. Every detail of the attacks had to be presented, every victim's final moments described, every piece of evidence catalogued for public record. The families of the dead sat in a reserved section, forced to relive their trauma for the sake of procedure. "This is cruelty," one father whispered loud enough for Briar to hear. "Making us sit through this instead of just executing them and being done." But the trials continued. Day after day, attacker after attacker, each one unrepentant, each one declaring that genocide against Genesis beings was justified, necessary, even holy. And with each testimony, Pure Heritage's propaganda reached new audiences. The trials were being broadcast, yes, but so were the attackers' justifications. Kingdoms that had been neutral were now hearing articulate defenses of anti-Genesis violence presented in legal proceedings that gave them legitimacy simply by treating them as serious arguments worthy of rebuttal. "We're giving them a platform," Ronan warned during a private council meeting halfway through the trials. Every broadcast reaches thousands who've never heard Pure Heritage ideology explained so coherently. "We're doing their recruitment for them." "The alternative is secret trials," Briar said, "which would confirm suspicions that we're hiding something, that we execute prisoners without due process, that we're exactly the tyrannical Genesis state Pure Heritage claims we are." "So we're trapped," Malwick said. "Transparency helps our enemies. Secrecy destroys our credibility. There's no winning move." "The winning move," Elder Morphia interjected, "is accepting that justice is expensive. That doing the right thing often benefits those who oppose you. Those principles maintained at personal cost are the only principles worth having." "Easy to say when it's not your family in that courtroom," Brennan muttered. The trials took 6 weeks. At the end, all 14 attackers were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, not execution, because Silver Peak had abolished capital punishment 5 years earlier, another principle that now felt like naive luxury. The families of the victims were devastated. "Life imprisonment," one mother screamed outside the courthouse. "They murdered my son and they got to live?" They get meals and shelter and the possibility of appeals while my child is Ash. Briar had no good answer. She stood before the grieving families and admitted the truth. Justice and satisfaction are not the same thing. I can give you justice. I cannot give you satisfaction. And I'm sorry that the difference feels like betrayal. Some families accepted this. Others turned away, their grief curdling into resentment that would poison Silver Peak's unity for years to come. But it was done. The trials were complete. Justice had been served according to law and principle. And 3 days later, pure heritage struck again. This time, they targeted the Genesis Academy itself. Not with fire or bombs, but with something more insidious, a biological weapon designed specifically to attack Genesis physiology. A plague that targeted those with mixed bloodline abilities while leaving pure bloodline citizens untouched. Vesper was among the first to fall ill. Briar found her in the Academy's infirmary, her body racked with convulsions as her Genesis abilities turned against her, light and shadow and wolf essence tearing her apart from the inside. It's targeting the instability, Lysander explained, his healer's hands glowing as he tried desperately to stabilize her. Genesis transformation creates intentional complexity in bloodline magic. This plague exploits that complexity, turning it from strength into vulnerability. How many are infected? Kael demanded. 47 so far, all Genesis beings. 32 students, 15 staff. Lysander's face was grim. And it's spreading. Anyone with Genesis abilities who comes into contact with infected individuals risks transmission. Quarantine, Briar ordered immediately. Isolate the infected, close the academy, no one in or out until we understand what we're dealing with. But even as she gave the orders, she knew what this meant. Pure Heritage had found a weapon that could kill Genesis beings while leaving everyone else untouched. A weapon that proved their propaganda, that Genesis transformation created weakness, that mixing bloodlines produced vulnerability, that separation was safety. Over the next 3 days, the death toll mounted. 12 dead, including 3 children under 15. Vesper survived but was left weakened, her Genesis abilities permanently diminished. Others weren't as fortunate. And across the continent, kingdoms watched and learned Genesis beings could be targeted specifically. They weren't invulnerable. They were, in fact, more vulnerable than pure bloodline citizens in certain ways. The propaganda practically wrote itself. We need to respond, Jack said during an emergency council meeting, his young face hard with fury. Not with trials and principles and measured justice. We need to find who created this plague, and we need to destroy them. We don't even know who created it, Ronan said. Then we assume it's pure heritage and we strike their known cells, Jax countered. Burn them out before they can deploy this weapon again. Becoming exactly what they claim we are, Briar said quietly. Violent, aggressive, willing to attack on suspicion rather than evidence. I don't care what they claim anymore, Jax shouted. I watched 3 children die this week. Die in agony because someone engineered a disease specifically to kill them. And you want me to care about optics? About principles? About not confirming their propaganda? Yes, Briar said simply. Because if we abandon those things, we've lost regardless of military victory. We become the monsters that make their fear justified. Then maybe we should be monsters, Jack said, his voice breaking. Maybe being good is just permission for them to keep killing us. The council chamber fell silent, everyone recognizing the fundamental question at the heart of Jax's outburst. How long could they maintain principles while people died? How many deaths were acceptable in pursuit of moral high ground? At what point did righteousness become complicity? I don't have a good answer, Briar admitted. I don't know where the line is between principled restraint and negligent passivity. But I know that once we cross into retributive violence, we can uncross it. We become the thing we're fighting, and all those deaths, all the suffering we've endured, becomes meaningless. It's already meaningless if we don't survive, Malwick said. Pure Heritage just demonstrated they can kill Genesis beings selectively. If they refine that plague, deploy it widely, they could eliminate every transformed person in Silver Peak without harming a single pure bloodline citizen. Which makes this an extinction-level threat, Darius added. And extinction doesn't care about principles. Kael had been silent throughout the debate, his alpha instincts warring with his commitment to Briar's vision. Finally, he spoke. We created a task force. Small, specialized, operating with strict rules of engagement. Their mission isn't revenge, it's prevention. They find pure heritage laboratories, they destroy plague research, they prevent future attacks. But they don't kill unless absolutely necessary for defense, they don't torture for information, and they operate under full council oversight. That's still escalation, Brennan objected. It's survival, Kael countered. There's a difference between seeking revenge and preventing genocide. We're not attacking pure heritage for what they've done. We're stopping them from doing it again. Briar wanted to argue, wanted to insist that even this was too much, that they should rely purely on diplomatic pressure and defensive measures. But she'd watched 12 people die from a plague engineered specifically to kill them. She'd held Vesper's hand while the young woman convulsed, her own Genesis abilities trying to tear her apart. Principles mattered, but so did survival. Limited scope, Briar said finally. The task force operates only against verified threats, laboratories, weapon stockpiles, active cells planning imminent attacks. They don't engage in broad raids, don't attack on suspicion, and every operation requires council approval. That's too restrictive, Jax argued. By the time we verify threats and get council approval, the attacks will have already happened. Then we accept that some attacks will happen, Briar said. Because the alternative is giving a small group permission to decide who lives and dies based on intelligence that might be wrong. That's how you create war crimes, not prevent them. The vote was close, 8-7 in favor of creating the task force with Briar's restrictions. Not a mandate, but permission. Enough to act, not enough to feel certain. The Genesis Guard was expanded to include this specialized unit, led by Jax despite his objections to the limitations placed on him. If anyone could operate with lethal capability while maintaining ethical constraints, it was him. The first operation launched a week later, a raid on a suspected pure heritage laboratory in the northern borderlands. The task force found the facility, confirmed it was developing a more potent version of the Genesis plague, and destroyed it. 0 casualties. Clean extraction. Everything by the book. But they also found evidence. Funding documents, communication records, supply manifests. And every piece of evidence pointed toward the same source. Eastern sovereignty wasn't just harboring pure heritage extremists. They were funding them, supplying them, giving them state resources to develop Genesis-specific weapons. They're not terrorists, Ronan said, presenting the evidence to the council. They're the covert operations arm of a hostile government. Pure heritage isn't grassroots extremism, it's state-sponsored genocide with plausible deniability. The revelation changed everything. Fighting terrorists was one thing. Fighting a kingdom, a legitimate, internationally recognized kingdom, was something else entirely. It meant war, not in the abstract sense of ideological conflict, but in the concrete sense of armies and sieges and casualties numbered in thousands rather than dozens. We need to present this evidence to the Continental Congress, Brennan said, referring to the coalition of kingdoms that maintained diplomatic order. Let international pressure force Eastern sovereignty to cease support. The Continental Congress moves at glacial pace, Malwick countered. By the time they convene, deliberate, and issue diplomatic censure, pure heritage will have deployed the refined plague. We'll be arguing procedure, while Genesis beings die by the hundreds. So, what do you suggest? Brennan asked. We invade Eastern sovereignty? Trigger a continental war. I suggest we make the cost of supporting pure heritage higher than the benefit, Malwick said. Economic sanctions, trade embargoes, diplomatic isolation. Make it clear that state-sponsored genocide has consequences. That's still an act of war, Brennan insisted. Economic warfare is still warfare. Then we're at war, Jax said quietly. Whether we acknowledge it or not. Eastern sovereignty has already made that choice for us. We're just deciding whether to fight back or die politely. Briar listened to the debate spiral, feeling the weight of a decision she'd spent 10 years hoping never to make. They'd tried principles, tried justice, tried restraint and diplomacy and every nonviolent option available. And Pure Heritage had responded by developing weapons to exterminate Genesis beings wholesale. At what point did pacifism become suicide? At what point did maintaining moral high ground mean watching your people die rather than defending them effectively? She looked around the council chamber, at faces transformed and unchanged, at people who'd spent a decade trying to build something better, at a kingdom that had dared to believe unity was possible. They deserved protection, but they also deserved to remain what they were, not an empire built on violence, but a refuge built on choice. Somehow, she had to find a way to give them both. We present the evidence to the Continental Congress, Briar decided. Immediately, urgently, demanding an emergency session. Simultaneously, we implement economic sanctions against Eastern sovereignty and any kingdom that continues trade relations with them. And we prepare for war, not because we want it, but because it may become necessary despite our efforts to avoid it. That's trying to have it both ways, Brennan observed. Yes, Briar agreed. Because there is no good option here. They're only trying to minimize harm while maintaining some shred of the principles that make us worth defending in the first place. It wasn't satisfying. It wasn't clear. It wasn't the kind of decisive leadership that would inspire songs. But it was honest. And honesty was all she had left. The storm Cassian had warned about was here. Not metaphorical, not potential, but present and deadly and demanding response. And Silver Peak would respond, not with the righteous certainty of those convinced their cause justified any action, but with the uncertain courage of those who believed that how you fight matters as much as what you fight for. Even when, especially when that belief cost everything. Chapter 18. The Continental Congress. The Continental Congress convened in the neutral city of Meridian, a place built specifically for diplomatic resolution, where no single kingdom held territory and ancient treaties prevented military presence within 50 miles of the city center. Briar arrived with a delegation of 20, Kael, Marcus, Ronan, Vesper, still recovering but insisting on attending, Jax, and representatives from both Genesis and Pure Bloodline communities. She'd learned that representation mattered, that showing unity required demonstrating it visibly. The Congress Hall was magnificent, a circular chamber with seating for delegates from all 37 kingdoms on the continent, designed so that no kingdom sat in a position of prominence. Every seat faced the center, where speakers presented their cases to the assembled nations. As Briar entered, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. Some curious, some hostile, all assessing whether the Genesis Queen was the visionary revolutionary her supporters claimed or the dangerous radical her opponents feared. The Eastern Sovereignties delegation sat directly across the circle. Ambassador Lucian, their chief diplomat, watched Briar with an expression of calculated neutrality that suggested he'd been preparing for this confrontation. The Continental Congress recognizes Queen Briar of Silver Peak, the moderator announced, a role rotated annually among kingdoms, currently held by the Western Isles elder statesmen. You have invoked emergency session privileges. Please present your cause. Briar moved to the center of the chamber, acutely aware that her next words would shape continental politics for years to come. Honored delegates, she began, her voice carrying through the acoustically perfect chamber. 10 years ago, Silver Peak underwent transformation. We chose to embrace Genesis abilities, the mixing of bloodline magic that the first council separated millennia ago. This choice was controversial, frightening to many, and I acknowledge the legitimate concerns it raised. She paused, meeting eyes around the circle. What followed were 10 years of complicated peace. Not perfect integration, but genuine attempt at plural unity. Genesis beings and pure bloodline citizens learning to coexist, stumbling often but trying consistently. 6 weeks ago, that peace was shattered. Coordinated attacks on border villages killed 12 people, 8 Genesis beings and 4 pure bloodline citizens defending them. The attackers identified themselves as Pure Heritage, an organization claiming to protect bloodline purity through elimination of Genesis manifestos. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. The attacks were known, but Briar's direct address made them immediate, present, impossible to dismiss as distant tragedy. We responded as a nation of laws. The attackers were tried publicly, transparently, with full legal representation. They were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, justice rendered through proper procedure rather than mob violence. 3 weeks ago, pure heritage struck again. This time with a biological weapon engineered specifically to kill Genesis beings while leaving pure bloodline citizens untouched. 15 died. Dozens more were permanently damaged. Children suffered deaths designed specifically for them. Briar's voice remained steady, but her Genesis stone pulsed with barely contained emotion. In responding to this attack, we discovered something that brings us here today. Pure Heritage is not a grassroots extremist organization. It is state-sponsored, state-funded, and state-supplied. She gestured, and Ronan activated the crystal projection system, a recent innovation that allowed documents to be displayed for all delegates simultaneously. Evidence filled the air: funding documents, supply manifests, communication records, laboratory construction permits. All of these documents originated from Eastern sovereignty. They show systematic government support for pure heritage operations, including the biological weapons laboratory that created the Genesis Plague. The chamber erupted. Eastern sovereignty delegates jumped to their feet, shouting denials. Other kingdoms demanded clarification. The moderator's gavel rang out repeatedly, restoring temporary order. Ambassador Lucian stood, his expression carefully calibrated outrage. These documents are fabrications. Forgeries created to justify Silver Peak's aggression against kingdoms that refuse to embrace their Genesis corruption. We have no association with pure heritage terrorism. Then explain the laboratory, Briar countered. Explain how a sophisticated biological weapons facility was constructed on your territory without government knowledge. Explain the supply routes that required crossing 3 military checkpoints. Explain the communications infrastructure linking pure heritage cells across the continent. I don't need to explain anything, Lucian replied coldly. The burden of proof lies with the accuser. And your evidence consists of documents acquired through illegal raids on sovereign territory, inadmissible in any legitimate legal proceeding. We're not in a courtroom, Kael interjected, standing to join Briar in the center. We're in the Continental Congress, addressing state-sponsored genocide. The evidence's legality is less important than its truth. And who determines the truth? Lucian challenged. You? The Genesis beings who stand to benefit from discrediting kingdoms that refuse transformation? Forgive me if I don't accept as truth evidence presented by those with obvious bias. The evidence can be verified, Ronan said, his diplomatic training evident in his calm tone. We invite independent investigation. Send Continental inspectors to examine the laboratory site, trace the supply chains, and interview pure heritage members in custody. If we're fabricating evidence, verification will reveal that. Or, Lucian countered smoothly, it will reveal that Silver Peak is skilled at creating convincing forgeries and coaching prisoners to confirm predetermined narratives. We're supposed to risk our sovereignty by allowing foreign investigators free access to military territory based on accusations from a kingdom that has spent a decade becoming exactly what the First Council warned us about. And what is that? Briar asked. What have we become that terrifies you so much? Unpredictable, Lucian said. Unstable. A kingdom where bloodline boundaries have dissolved, where traditional order has collapsed, where abilities exist that defy centuries of magical understanding. You represent chaos, Queen Briar. Necessary chaos to you, perhaps, but chaos nonetheless. And kingdoms have a right, a responsibility, to protect themselves from chaos. By developing weapons to exterminate Genesis beings? Vesper called out, her voice still weak from the plague, but fierce with conviction. That's protection? That's genocide. That's prevention, Lucian corrected. If a plague threatened your kingdom, you develop cures, yes? If an invasive species endangered your ecosystem, you develop controls. Genesis manifestation is spreading, spontaneous appearances across the continent, second-generation effects, unpredictable mutations. Some kingdoms view this as evolution. Others view it as contagion. We have the right to protect ourselves from contagion. The argument was elegant, logical, and absolutely horrifying. Lucian was equating Genesis beings with disease, transformation with infection, and framing genocide as public health policy. And from the expressions around the chamber, some delegates were finding the argument persuasive. "You're describing people," Briar said quietly, dangerously. "Children who manifested abilities they didn't choose. Adults who underwent transformation voluntarily. Living, thinking, feeling people with families and dreams and the fundamental right to exist. You're calling them contagion." "I'm calling the phenomenon contagion," Lucian clarified. "The people themselves are victims, tragic casualties of a transformation process they may not have chosen but which threatens the stability of ordered society nonetheless. We don't hate Genesis beings. We pity them. But pity doesn't override our responsibility to protect our citizens from similar contamination." "Contamination," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. "I haven't heard that word used to describe people since the original bloodline separation. When the first council decided that mixing was corruption, that difference was disease, that anyone who crossed boundaries was contaminated." He moved to stand with Briar and Kael, his transformed presence undeniable. "I was the Shadow King for decades. I enforced separation with brutality. I believed, as you apparently do, Ambassador Lucian, that purity mattered more than compassion. That order justified cruelty. That protection required dehumanizing those we feared. And I was wrong," Marcus continued. "Wrong about what made people valuable. Wrong about what threatened society. Wrong about everything except my own fear, which I dressed up as principle and wielded as a weapon. You stand there calling Genesis beings contamination, describing children as contagion, framing genocide as prevention. And I recognize the arguments because I used to make them. They're the same arguments that justified 6 years of torture for my daughter. The same logic that allowed atrocity to be called necessity. So, when you ask the Continental Congress to dismiss Silver Peak's evidence, to accept your denials, to treat state-sponsored genocide as legitimate self-defense, understand that you're asking them to repeat the First Council's greatest mistake. To choose fear over wisdom. To confuse comfort with safety. To sacrifice principles for the illusion of control." Marcus's testimony carried weight. A former enforcer of separation arguing for unity, a Shadow King transformed into an advocate for Genesis beings. Several delegates who'd been nodding along with Lucian's arguments now looked uncertain. But Lucian wasn't finished. "The Shadow King speaks of mistakes and wisdom. Perhaps the Continental Congress should consider his personal history. He spent decades enforcing separation, then suddenly embraced transformation after his daughter, the Genesis Queen herself, forced change upon him. Is this wisdom, or is this Stockholm Syndrome? A man who's been fundamentally altered defending the alteration." "That's a cheap attack," Kael growled, his alpha presence making several delegates flinch. "It's relevant context," Lucian insisted. "Every person arguing for Genesis acceptance in this chamber has been transformed. They're not objective observers. They're advocates with literal investment in proving transformation is benign. Meanwhile, kingdoms that have maintained traditional bloodline practice watch Genesis manifestation spread, watch transformed beings develop abilities that defy historical limitation, and watch Silver Peak demand we accept this as progress rather than threat." He turned to address the full Congress. "I ask the assembled kingdoms, are we required to embrace transformation simply because one kingdom chose it? Are we forbidden from protecting ourselves because Silver Peak decided protection equals prejudice? Do we surrender sovereignty over our own bloodline policies to avoid accusations of discrimination?" "These are legitimate questions," several delegates murmured in agreement. Briar felt the chamber's mood shifting. Lucian was skilled, framing state-sponsored genocide as reasonable self-defense, transformation as aggressive expansion, and Silver Peak as the real threat to continental stability. She had one chance to shift momentum back. One argument that might cut through the rhetorical sophistication to reach fundamental truth. "Ambassador Lucian," Briar said carefully, You've spent this session framing Genesis transformation as threat, contagion, chaos requiring containment. You've suggested that kingdoms have the right to protect themselves from Genesis manifestation. I want to clarify exactly what that protection entails. She activated another document projection. Medical reports from pure heritage attacks, images too graphic for comfortable viewing but necessary for honest assessment. This is 9-year-old Alara Brightstone. Genesis abilities manifested spontaneously when she was 7. According to your framework, she became contaminated. Pure Heritage's solution to her contamination was fire. She burned to death, apologizing for existing. Next image. 16-year-old Rowan Nightshade manifested Genesis abilities during a public ceremony. According to your framework, a tragedy, he became a victim of transformation he didn't choose. Pure Heritage's solution was the Genesis plague. He died over 6 days, his own abilities tearing him apart from inside. More images, each one a person reduced to casualty, each one a child or a teenager whose crime was existing in a way that frightened others. You speak of protection, Ambassador. I'm showing you what that protection looks like in practice. Not abstract policy, not careful rhetoric, but burned bodies and children dying in agony because someone decided they were contamination requiring removal. Briar's voice remained steady despite tears threatening. So, I asked the Continental Congress directly, is this acceptable? Is this the kind of protection we want to legitimize through diplomatic neutrality? Because if the answer is yes, if we decide that kingdoms can define Genesis beings as contagion and respond accordingly, then we're not preventing chaos. We're codifying genocide. The chamber fell into heavy silence, delegates confronting images that made rhetorical distance impossible. Finally, the moderator spoke. The Continental Congress will recess for deliberation. We reconvene in 3 days to vote on formal censure of Eastern sovereignty and potential sanctions for state-sponsored terrorism. It wasn't the immediate action Briar had hoped for, but it was something. The evidence was presented, the argument made, the choice before the assembled kingdoms. Now came the hardest part, waiting to see if justice mattered more than comfort, if principles outweighed convenience, if the Continental Congress would act or merely deliberate while more Genesis beings died. As delegates filed out, Lucian approached Briar directly. His diplomatic mask had slipped slightly, revealing something harder beneath. "You've made a powerful enemy today," he said quietly. "Eastern sovereignty will not forget this accusation." "Good," Briar replied, "because Silver Peak won't forget what you've done to justify it." They stood there for a moment, two representatives of incompatible philosophies, both certain they were right, both prepared to sacrifice principles to survive. The war was no longer coming. It was here. And the Continental Congress had 3 days to decide which side of history they wanted to occupy. Chapter 19. 3 Days of Consequence. The delegates' quarter in Meridian was designed for diplomatic isolation, each kingdom housed in separate wings, communication controlled and monitored to prevent the kind of backroom deals that undermined official proceedings. But diplomacy always found a way. On the first night of recess, Briar received 3 visitors. The first was Ambassador Talia from the Southern Archipelago, a cluster of island kingdoms that had remained staunchly neutral on Genesis matters. She arrived with 2 guards and an expression of careful calculation. "Your presentation today was effective," Talia said without preamble. "The images especially." Several delegates who were leaning toward accepting Eastern sovereignty's explanation are now reconsidering. "But," Briar prompted, hearing the unspoken caveat, "but effectiveness isn't the same as wisdom. You've forced the Continental Congress into a binary choice, support Silver Peak's accusations or implicitly endorse genocide. That's rhetorically powerful but politically dangerous. You've eliminated middle ground, and middle ground is where compromise lives." "There is no middle ground between genocide and human rights," Briar said. "There's always middle ground," Talia countered. "Conditional sanctions. Monitored investigations. Diplomatic pressure without economic warfare. You're asking the Congress to choose absolute positions when most kingdoms prefer gradual approaches." Gradual approaches mean more Genesis beings die while we negotiate comfortable solutions, Kael interjected. Yes, Talia agreed without apology. That's the cost of maintaining international order. Some injustice persists while systems work through proper channels. It's not satisfying, but it's stable. And stability matters when the alternative is continental war. So you're asking us to accept ongoing genocide for the sake of stability, Briar said flatly. I'm telling you the political reality you're confronting, Talia corrected. The Continental Congress moves slowly by design. Forcing rapid decisions on existential questions makes delegates nervous, and nervous delegates vote for the status quo. If you want censure and sanctions, you need to give kingdoms time to justify those actions to their citizens. Time to build domestic support for economic consequences. Time to feel like they're choosing rather than being coerced. We don't have time, Vesper said from where she sat, still weak from the plague. Pure Heritage is refining their bioweapon. Every day we delay is another day they get closer to deployment. Then you'll need to present evidence of imminent threat, Talia said. Not just past attacks and financial documents, but proof that genocide is actively underway or immediately planned. Give the Congress a reason to act urgently beyond your moral outrage. Our moral outrage is about dead children, Jack said, his voice tight with controlled fury. I know, Talia replied, and for a moment her diplomatic mask slipped to reveal genuine sympathy. And, in a just world, that would be sufficient. But the Continental Congress isn't a court of justice. It's a political body designed to maintain order among kingdoms with competing interests. You're asking them to risk economic disruption, potential military conflict, and diplomatic chaos. They need more than moral clarity. They need political cover. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, the Southern Archipelago will vote for censure. Limited sanctions, contingent on verified evidence, subject to review in 6 months. It's inadequate, I know. But it's what I can deliver without destabilizing my own government. After she left, Briar sat in silence, processing the brutal honesty of Talia's assessment. Justice required political maneuvering. Righteousness needed coalition building. Saving lives demanded compromise with systems designed to move slowly. She's right, Ronan said finally. We came here expecting the Congress to act on moral principle. But most kingdoms are more concerned with maintaining stability than pursuing justice. We need to give them pragmatic reasons to support us beyond. It's the right thing to do. The second visitor arrived near midnight. Elder Cassius from the Western Reaches, one of the continent's oldest kingdoms and traditionally a leader in setting diplomatic precedent. He came alone, moving with the careful dignity of someone who'd witnessed a century of political maneuvering. I'm not here officially, Cassius said, settling into a chair with a sigh that betrayed his age. What I'm about to tell you cannot be attributed to the Western Reaches or used in official proceedings. Understood? Understood, Briar agreed. Eastern sovereignty has spent the past year building a coalition. 23 kingdoms have signed a mutual defense pact. If any signatory is sanctioned by the Continental Congress, the others will respond with coordinated economic retaliation against kingdoms supporting the sanctions. The implications hit Briar like a physical blow. They've created a voting bloc. More than that, Cassius said. They've created insurance against consequences. If the Congress votes for sanctions, those 23 kingdoms immediately cut trade with any nation supporting the measure. The economic disruption would be catastrophic, potentially enough to trigger continental recession. So we're being held hostage, Kael said. Vote for justice and watch the economy collapse. Effectively, yes, Cassius agreed. Eastern sovereignty has been preparing for this confrontation. They knew eventually their pure heritage support would be exposed. So they built a structure where exposing them costs more than ignoring them. Why are you telling us this? Marcus asked suspiciously. Because it's evil genius, Cassius said with grim admiration. And because I'm old enough to remember what happens when international bodies choose convenience over principle. The First Council made that choice when they decided separation was easier than integration. We're still living with those consequences. He leaned forward. I'll vote for full sanctions regardless of economic cost. The Western reaches will absorb the consequences because some principles matter more than prosperity. But I'm one vote among 37. Most delegates will calculate that abstract justice for Genesis beings isn't worth concrete economic suffering for their citizens. So we've already lost, Vesper said quietly. You've lost the vote for meaningful sanctions, Cassius corrected. But you might win something more valuable: public awareness. Every kingdom is watching these proceedings. Every citizen is learning about pure heritage, about bioweapons targeting Genesis beings, about state-sponsored genocide. You're making neutrality expensive in different ways, not economically, but morally. Moral expenses don't stop weapons development, Jack said. No, Cassius agreed. But they create political pressure that eventually forces change. Not quickly enough to save everyone. Not cleanly enough to satisfy justice. But change nonetheless. He stood with effort, age weighing on him. 3 days from now, the Congress will vote for limited censure and conditional sanctions. It will be inadequate. It will feel like betrayal. But it will be the beginning of something. The first time the Continental Congress officially acknowledged that Genesis beings have rights worth protecting, however inadequately. That's not enough, Briar said. It never is, Cassius replied. But insufficient progress is still progress. Take it, build on it, and keep pushing. That's how change happens, not through dramatic revolution, but through accumulated incremental improvements that eventually transform everything. The third visitor arrived at dawn. No ambassador, no elder statesman, but a young woman who identified herself only as Nyx from the Eastern Sovereignty. She was Genesis-touched. Briar could see it in the way light and shadow played across her skin, the telltale signs of mixed bloodline abilities. I'm risking execution by being here, Nyx said, her fear palpable. If the Sovereignty discovers I left our delegation quarters, if they learn I have Genesis abilities I've been hiding for 3 years, they'll kill me. Then why come? Briar asked gently. Because someone needs to tell you the truth about what's happening in Eastern Sovereignty, about what Pure Heritage is really planning. She pulled out stolen documents, crude copies made hastily but legible, deployment schedules, target assessments, refined plague specifications. The bioweapon that hit Silver Peak was the prototype, Nyx explained. They're developing a second generation that's airborne, longer-lasting, harder to detect. Current estimates suggest it could infect every Genesis being on the continent within 6 months of release. Continental genocide, Marcus breathed. They're calling it the final separation, Nyx continued. A return to bloodline purity enforced through elimination of anyone whose abilities cross traditional boundaries. They're planning deployment in 8 months, pending final testing. Why tell us?
Kael asked.
Why not take this directly to the Continental Congress? Because they won't believe me, Nyx said simply. I'm nobody. A scared girl with stolen documents that could be forgeries. But you're the Genesis Queen. If you present this evidence, if you verify it through your intelligence networks, it carries weight. It gives the Congress the imminent threat they need to justify immediate action. She handed the documents to Briar. I don't know if this helps. I don't know if anything can stop what's coming. But I had to try. Because I've been hiding what I am for 3 years, watching other Genesis beings die, telling myself it was safer to stay invisible. And I can't do it anymore. I can't watch genocide unfold while I protect myself through cowardice. This isn't cowardice, Vesper said softly. Coming here, risking everything to warn us. That's courage. It's too late courage, Nyx replied. But it's what I have. She left before Briar could offer asylum, disappearing back into the Eastern Sovereignty's delegation quarters to maintain her cover. Ronan immediately began verifying the documents, cross-referencing with intelligence Silver Peak had gathered, checking technical specifications against known Pure Heritage capabilities, analyzing paper stock and ink composition to confirm authenticity. By evening of the second day, he had confirmation. The documents are legitimate. This is actual Pure Heritage planning material, not fabricated intelligence. The final separation is real. Then we present this to the Congress, Briar said. It won't be enough, Ronan warned. Talia was right. Most kingdoms will see this as reason for careful monitoring, not immediate action. They'll propose investigation committees, extended deliberation periods, and diplomatic negotiations. All things that take months, while Pure Heritage finalizes their weapon. So, what do we do? Jax asked. Accept that the Continental Congress will move too slowly, and people will die while they deliberate. Briar looked at the documents Nyx had risked everything to deliver. Looked at her council, Genesis and Pure Bloodline, transformed and unchanged, all united in desperate recognition that they were out of good options. We present the evidence, she decided. We give the Continental Congress every opportunity to do the right thing. And simultaneously, we prepare for them to fail. We accelerate Genesis Guard operations, we increase defensive preparations, and we make it very clear that if the Congress won't protect Genesis beings, Silverpeak will. With or without international approval. That's declaring we'll operate outside the Continental Order, Marcus said. That will violate sovereignty if necessary. Yes, Briar agreed. Because the Continental Order has proven inadequate to prevent genocide. I'd prefer to work within established systems. But I won't watch my people die while those systems debate proper procedure. That makes us the aggressors, Brennan said. Exactly what the Eastern sovereignty claims we are. Then let them be right, Briar replied. I'd rather be accurately accused of aggression than falsely praised for restraint while Genesis beings are exterminated. It was the line she'd spent 10 years refusing to cross. The moment where principles yielded to survival, where moral high ground became unaffordable luxury. She'd become what she'd sworn never to be, a leader willing to sacrifice international law for her people's protection. But watching those she'd sworn to protect die, while respecting systems designed to move slowly, had become impossible. On the third day, the Continental Congress reconvened. Briar presented Nyx's evidence, the final separation plans, the refined bioweapon specifications, the 8-month timeline to continental genocide. The chamber erupted. Some delegates declared the evidence fabricated. Others demanded immediate investigation. A few called for military intervention. But when the vote came, the result was exactly what Elder Cassius had predicted. Limited censure of Eastern sovereignty. Conditional sanctions pending independent verification. Formation of an investigation committee to assess Pure Heritage activities. Inadequate. Insufficient.
Too slow to prevent what was coming.
But technically, progress. The first time the Continental Congress had officially acknowledged Genesis rights. Briar stood as the vote was announced, feeling the weight of a decision she'd hoped never to make. Silverpeak thanks the Continental Congress for its consideration, she said formally. We will cooperate fully with investigation committees and comply with all proper procedures. She paused, meeting eyes around the chamber. But we will not wait for those procedures to conclude while Genesis beings die. Silverpeak will defend its citizens and offer asylum to Genesis manifestors from any kingdom, regardless of that kingdom's approval. We will operate within international law where possible, but we will operate regardless. That's a declaration of independence from Continental Order, the moderator said. No, Briar corrected. It's a declaration that Continental Order must serve justice, not replace it. If the Congress cannot protect Genesis beings, then Silverpeak will, and we invite any kingdom that shares our values to join us. It was a rebellion, diplomatically phrased but unmistakable. The Continental Congress adjourned in chaos, some kingdoms pledging support, others declaring Silverpeak's stance unacceptable, most remaining neutral while they assessed which side would ultimately prevail. As Briar left the Congress Hall, she found Nyx waiting in the shadows. Thank you, the young woman whispered. For trying. It wasn't enough, Briar said. It was something, Nyx replied. And sometimes something is all we get. She disappeared before Briar could offer asylum again, returning to her dangerous cover in the Eastern sovereignty. A hero who would remain unknown. A courage that would never be celebrated. One of thousands of small acts that might, collectively, be enough to prevent the final separation. Or might simply delay it while the Continental Congress deliberated and Silverpeak prepared for war. Chapter 20. The Choice Between Worlds. The journey back to Silver Peak took 5 days, longer than necessary because Briar couldn't bring herself to rush toward what waited there.
War.
Not metaphorical, not ideological, but actual war. Armies and casualties and decisions that would haunt her forever. On the third night, as their caravan camped in the borderlands between kingdoms, Vesper found Briar sitting alone on a hillside overlooking valleys that had known peace for 3 generations. "You're thinking about running," Vesper said, settling beside her former queen and current friend. "Is it that obvious?" Briar asked. "Only to those who know you." Vesper pulled her cloak tighter against the evening chill. "You're thinking that if you abdicated, if you stepped down and let someone else lead Silver Peak, maybe the Continental Congress would be more willing to act. Maybe Eastern sovereignty would lose their primary target. Maybe Genesis beings would be safer without you." "Would they be wrong?" Briar asked. "I'm the Genesis Queen, the symbol of transformation, the living proof that bloodlines can mix. Maybe I'm the reason pure heritage exists. Maybe without me, they'd find another reason," Vesper interrupted. "Another target, another justification. Genesis manifestation is happening across the continent, spontaneous and inevitable. You didn't cause that. You just showed it was survivable. Removing yourself doesn't eliminate the threat. It just removes the person best equipped to organize resistance." "I'm not equipped," Briar said quietly. "I'm a woman who spent 6 years in a dungeon. I know torture and darkness, and how to survive when everything is trying to kill you. But I don't know about war. I don't know military strategy. I don't know how to make decisions that will definitely kill people and might still fail." "Neither did any leader before their first war," Vesper said. "Leadership isn't about already knowing. It's about making the best decision possible with inadequate information and then living with the consequences. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be. It's meant to be true." They sat in silence, watching stars emerge against the darkening sky. "I keep thinking about that 9-year-old, Briar said finally. "The one who died apologizing for existing. About Nyx risking execution to deliver evidence. About all the Genesis beings across the continent who are hiding right now, terrified that any day pure heritage might find them. And you're thinking that your discomfort with war, your moral uncertainty, your desperate wish that someone else would make these decisions, all of that matters less than protecting them," Vesper finished. "Yes," Briar admitted. "Good," Vesper said simply. "Because leaders who are comfortable with war are the ones you need to worry about. The fact that you're agonizing over this, that you're looking for any alternative, that you're willing to sacrifice your own comfort rather than other people's lives, that's what makes you worth following." "Even into war?" "Especially into war," Vesper replied. "Because you'll fight it the way it needs to be fought, reluctantly, carefully, with constant awareness of cost. Not as a glorious crusade, but as a terrible necessity pursued with minimum required force." "And if I fail?" Briar asked. "If my reluctance costs lives? If careful restraint means Genesis beings die, who could have been saved by more aggressive action?" "Then you'll fail while trying to minimize harm," Vesper said. "Which is better than succeeding through maximizing it. War has no good choices, only less terrible ones. Your job is to find the less terrible path and walk it despite everything screaming that you should choose easier violence." She stood, offering her hand to Briar. "Come on. Kael is probably pacing a trench into the campsite worrying about you. And Jax wants to discuss defensive formations, which apparently can't wait until we're actually home." Briar took her hand, standing with effort. "When did you get so wise?" "I was 16 when pure heritage tried to kill me the first time," Vesper said. "Wisdom comes fast when the alternative is death." They arrived at Silver Peak to find the kingdom transformed. In the 5 days since the Continental Congress vote, the Genesis Guard had tripled in size. Defensive fortifications ringed the capital. Refugee camps housed 200 new arrivals, Genesis manifestors who'd fled kingdoms where pure heritage operated openly. And at the center of it all, in the war room that had once been a simple council chamber, Darius had assembled what looked like continental invasion planning. "Welcome back," he said without preamble. "We got problems." He activated the projection system, showing a map of the continent marked with threat indicators. Pure heritage cells in 19 kingdoms, up from 12 a month ago. Genesis manifestors being hunted in at least 7 nations. Eastern Sovereignty has deployed military units to their border with our territory, officially for defensive purposes, but positioned for rapid offensive action. Timeline. Kael asked immediately, his alpha instincts assessing tactical realities. Best estimate? The Eastern Sovereignty will manufacture a border incident within 6 weeks to justify invasion. They'll claim we're harboring terrorists, destabilizing the region, threatening continental security, whatever excuse plays best to their mutual defense pact. Then 23 kingdoms have the excuse to attack simultaneously while maintaining legal cover. We can't fight 23 kingdoms, Brennan said flatly. Even with Genesis abilities, we don't have the population or resources. We don't need to fight all 23, Jax countered. Most of them don't actually want war with Silver Peak. They just don't want to violate their pact. If we can break the Eastern Sovereignty quickly, demonstrate that supporting pure heritage is costly, the pact collapses. That requires invading Eastern Sovereignty preemptively, Marcus said. Becoming the aggressors. We're already the aggressors in their narrative, Jax replied. Might as well earn the accusation by actually preventing genocide instead of just being accused of plotting it. That's war crime logic, Brennan objected. Justifying aggression because we're already accused. It's survival logic, Jax countered. We can maintain moral purity while pure heritage completes their final separation weapon, or we can act now to prevent deployment. The argument spiraled, the same positions rehearsed with increasing intensity. Briar listened, hearing the fundamental impossibility embedded in every proposed solution. Any action aggressive enough to prevent genocide would confirm accusations that Genesis beings were dangerous, while any restraint sufficient to maintain moral authority would be inadequate to save lives. Enough, she said finally, her Genesis power making the word resonate through the chamber. We're not invading Eastern Sovereignty preemptively. That's the line I won't cross, becoming invaders to prevent being invaded. Then what? Jax demanded. We wait for them to attack first? Let them choose the time and place of engagement while we maintain the moral high ground from our graves. We give them a choice, Briar said, an idea forming even as she spoke. We don't invade, but we don't wait passively either. We make the cost of aggression so obviously catastrophic that even kingdoms bound by mutual defense pacts think twice about participation. She moved to the map, tracing borders and defensive positions. Eastern Sovereignty wants war because they believe they can win quickly. Demonstrate Genesis power, crush resistance, prove that transformation creates weakness rather than strength. If they win fast, the Mutual Defense Pact holds. Member kingdoms can claim they were supporting legitimate action against destabilizing force. But if they can't win quickly? Ronan caught her meaning. If Silver Peak proves capable of sustained resistance, suddenly the pact becomes liability. Member kingdoms start calculating whether treaty obligations are worth extended conflict. Exactly, Briar confirmed. We don't attack. But we prepare defense so formidable that invasion becomes obviously expensive. Then we wait. Let the Eastern Sovereignty decide whether their ideology is worth the cost, or whether they'd prefer diplomatic solutions that preserve their resources. That only works if we can actually sustain defense, Darius said pragmatically. Right now, our fortifications are adequate for brief engagement. Extended siege would exhaust us. Then we have 6 weeks to make them adequate for extended defense, Briar replied. Every Genesis being with construction abilities works on fortifications. Every transformed citizen with enhanced strength reinforces walls. Every manifester with strategic value gets intensive training. She turned to face the assembled council. I know this isn't satisfying. I know it feels like we're still being reactive, still letting others set terms of engagement. But it's the path that preserves both our principles and our people. We become a fortress that's too expensive to crack, and we trust that when presented with catastrophic cost, even ideological enemies choose preservation over destruction. And if they attack anyway? Vesper asked quietly. If ideology trumps pragmatism? Then we defend, Briar said simply. With everything Genesis transformation makes possible, we show them that eliminating us costs more than tolerating us. And we hope that demonstration is enough to break the mutual defense pact before all 23 kingdoms commit to our destruction. It wasn't a plan for victory. It was a plan for survival expensive enough to discourage attack. Not inspiring, but honest. I'll mobilize construction efforts, Darius said, accepting the strategy even if he didn't love it. I'll coordinate Genesis warrior training, Jax added, his earlier frustration channeled into practical preparation. One by one, the council committed to roles in fortification, each contributing to the fortress Silver Peak would become. As the meeting dispersed, Kael caught Briar's arm. This is the right approach. The only one that doesn't require abandoning who we are. But will it work? Briar asked. I don't know, Kael admitted. But it's our best chance of finding out without becoming the thing we're fighting. That night, Briar stood on Silver Peak's highest tower, looking at the kingdom she'd helped transform. Below, Genesis beings and pure bloodline citizens worked side by side, reinforcing walls, training for defense, preparing for war they hoped wouldn't come. 10 years ago, she believed transformation would unite them. 5 years ago, she believed plural unity was sustainable. 3 years ago, she believed the Continental Congress would eventually support Genesis rights. Every belief had proven more complicated than anticipated. Every solution revealed new problems. Every answer had generated harder questions. But they were still here, still trying, still building something worth defending despite knowing defense might not be enough. Doubting again? Marcus asked, appearing beside her with the quiet that came from shadow abilities. Always, Briar admitted. Good, her father said. The moment leaders stop doubting is the moment they become tyrants. Certainty is dangerous in positions of power. How did you do it? Briar asked. Lead with certainty all those years as Shadow King? By being wrong, Marcus said simply. By convincing myself that doubt was weakness, that conviction was strength, that leaders who questioned themselves couldn't be trusted. I was absolutely certain I was right about bloodline separation. And absolutely certain transformation was corruption. Absolutely certain that eliminating Genesis beings was necessary protection.
He paused.
And I was absolutely wrong about all of it. Cost me everything. My mate, my daughter, decades of my life serving fear disguised as principle. Your doubt, your uncertainty, your desperate search for alternatives to violence, those aren't weaknesses. They're the only things keeping you human while making inhuman choices. Does it get easier? Briar asked. Making those choices? No, Marcus said honestly. It gets harder. Because every choice you make successfully makes the next one feel more justified. Every time violence works, it becomes more tempting to choose violence first. Every time aggression achieves goals, it becomes harder to pursue patience. So, how do I avoid becoming what you were? By remembering what you started as, Marcus replied. A girl in chains who survived through stubborn hope that something better was possible. Keep that memory. Let it ground every decision. Ask yourself before every choice, would the girl in the dungeon recognize who I'm becoming? If the answer is no, reconsider. Briar looked at her father. This man who tried to kill her, imprisoned her, denied her, and now stood beside her offering hard-won wisdom purchased through decades of failure. Would she recognize you? Briar asked. The man you were as Shadow King. Would he recognize who you've become? God, I hope not, Marcus said with feeling. I hope he'd be horrified.
Disgusted.
Convinced I'd been corrupted beyond recognition. Because that's how I know I've actually changed. The man I was would hate the man I've become. He smiled, sad but genuine. Your mother would recognize me, though. She'd say about damn time and then probably hit me for taking so long. But she'd recognize me. That's the standard I aim for, not whether past me approves, but whether she would. I wish I'd known her, Briar said quietly. She'd have loved you, Marcus replied. Been so proud of what you've built here. Would have been furious about the compromises you've had to make, the principles you've had to bend. But proud of how you bent them. Carefully, reluctantly, always looking for a better way. They stood in silence, father and daughter watching their kingdom prepare for war neither wanted, but both knew might be inevitable. 6 weeks until the Eastern sovereignty manufactured their border incident. 6 weeks to build fortress walls strong enough to discourage attack. 6 weeks to hope that when faced with catastrophic cost, even ideological enemies chose wisdom over destruction. The Genesis Bridge had been built. Now they had to defend it and discover whether bridges could withstand war or whether violence would finally prove the First Council right, that separation was the only sustainable state and unity was just a beautiful delusion waiting to collapse under pressure. The answer would come soon. Whether anyone would survive to learn from it remained uncertain. Chapter 21. The Manufactured Crisis. The border incident came 5 weeks early. Briar was in the fortification trenches, helping Genesis construction workers reinforce the eastern wall, when the emergency bells rang. The pattern was unmistakable: 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. Foreign incursion. She was in the command center within minutes, Kael arriving simultaneously from the opposite direction. The war room had been transformed into a tactical operations hub, projection crystals displaying real-time intelligence from border scouts. Status, Kael commanded. The Eastern Sovereignty military crossed our border 30 minutes ago, Darius reported, his face grim. Not a scouting party, a full battalion, 500 strong. They've occupied the border town of Ashfeld and are claiming it's now under sovereignty protection. On what grounds? Briar demanded. They're saying Ashfeld requested annexation. That Genesis beings were terrorizing pure bloodline citizens, and the town council petitioned the sovereignty for protection from Silver Peak's Genesis tyranny. That's fabricated, Ronan said immediately. I was in Ashfield 3 weeks ago. It's one of our most integrated communities, Genesis and pure bloodline citizens living peacefully together. There's no conflict there, certainly not enough to justify requesting foreign intervention. The town council is holding a press conference in 2 hours, Darius continued, broadcasting across the continent. They'll declare that Silver Peak failed to protect them from Genesis violence, and they're exercising their sovereign right to seek protection elsewhere. Briar felt ice settle in her stomach. They've been planning this. Found or created a compromised town council, manufactured a crisis, and now they're creating legal cover for invasion. It's elegant, Marcus said bitterly. They're not invading Silver Peak. They're protecting citizens from Genesis aggression. The Mutual Defense Pact activates not because they attacked us, but because we're supposedly the aggressors forcing them to intervene. Can we prove the town council is compromised? Vesper asked. Eventually, Ronan said. But not in 2 hours. Not before their broadcast establishes the narrative across the continent. By the time we prove it's manufactured, the legal justification will be set. Other kingdoms will have committed to supporting the sovereignty's protective intervention. So we're trapped, Brennan said. If we do nothing, we lose Ashfeld, and the sovereignty gains a foothold on our territory. If we respond militarily to reclaim the town, we confirm we're aggressors suppressing citizens who requested protection. What about the actual citizens of Ashfeld? Briar asked. What do they say? That's the problem, Darius replied, activating another projection. The sovereignty has locked down the town. No one in or out. All communication blocked. We can't reach actual residents to get their testimony before the compromised council's broadcast. Jax studied the tactical display. We could infiltrate. Small Genesis strike team, cross the blockade using our abilities, extract actual town council members and residents. Get their testimony out before the broadcast. That's an act of war, Malwick objected. Crossing into occupied territory, engaging sovereignty military, we'd be giving them exactly the justification they want. They already have justification, Jax countered. They manufactured it. This is about whether we let their lies stand unchallenged or whether we provide the truth, even if providing it requires force. The familiar argument, principles versus pragmatism, moral authority versus tactical necessity. We do both, Briar decided. Jax, assemble your strike team. Extract as many Ashfield residents as possible. Prioritize those who can testify about what actually happened. But she held up a hand as he started to object. Rules of engagement are strict. You don't engage sovereignty forces unless they attack first. Your extraction, not assault. Minimum force, maximum witnesses. That reduces our operational effectiveness, Jax argued. It preserves our credibility, Briar countered. If we go in weapons hot, killing sovereignty soldiers to extract witnesses, we prove we're the aggressors they claim. But if we extract witnesses while avoiding engagement, we demonstrate restraint even under provocation. Restraint gets people killed, Jack said, but his tone had shifted from argument to acceptance. But I understand. We'll follow engagement rules. Ronan, prepare a counter-broadcast, Briar continued. As soon as Jax's team returns with witnesses, we go live across the continent with actual Ashfield residents explaining what really happened. Make it emotional, make it personal, make it impossible to dismiss as propaganda. The sovereignty will claim we coerce the witnesses, Ronan warned. Let them, Briar said. We'll have dozens of residents telling consistent stories. They'll have a compromised council reading prepared statements. Let the continent decide which is more credible. And if Jax's extraction fails? Kael asked. If the sovereignty has locked down Ashfield too effectively to reach real residents. Then we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back, Briar admitted. But that's preferable to fighting without principles and losing what makes us worth defending in the first place. Jax departed within the hour, leading a team of 12 Genesis warriors, the most skilled at stealth, extraction, and non-lethal engagement. Briar watched them disappear into the border forests, each one carrying the weight of a mission that might determine whether Silver Peak went to war. The next 90 minutes were agony. Briar tried to focus on fortification reports, refugee placement, resource allocation, all the mundane details that kept a kingdom functioning during crisis. But her attention kept returning to the projection crystal showing Ashfield's borders, waiting for any sign of Jax's team. 60 minutes until the compromised council's broadcast. 60 minutes to extract witnesses, return to Silver Peak, and prepare counter-narrative. 45 minutes. Still no word. 30 minutes. The command center grew tense, everyone trying to work while watching the crystal displaying Ashfield. 15 minutes. Darius started preparing contingency plans for if the extraction failed, if they had to respond to the sovereignty's narrative without witness testimony. 5 minutes. The compromised council began gathering for their broadcast, cameras positioning, continental networks preparing to carry the feed. Then, with 3 minutes to spare, Jax's voice crackled through the communication crystal. Extraction successful. 32 residents secured, including 4 actual town council members. We're inbound, ETA 20 minutes. Relief flooded the command center, but there was no time to celebrate. Get them to the broadcast studio immediately upon arrival, Briar ordered. Ronan, prepare them as they travel. I want them to be comfortable, confident, ready to tell their stories the moment cameras activate. The compromised council's broadcast began on schedule. Briar forced herself to watch, studying the propaganda that would justify invasion. People of the continent, the speaker began, a man Briar didn't recognize, certainly not Ashfield's actual council leader. We are the town council of Ashfield, and we come before you today with heavy hearts and urgent pleas. For months, we have lived under Genesis tyranny. Silver Peak claims to offer unity, but the reality is suppression. Pure bloodline citizens are second class in our own homes. Genesis beings use their abilities to intimidate, to coerce, to force transformation on those who wish to remain as they are. Lies, all of it, but delivered with conviction, with emotion, with details specific enough to sound credible. We petitioned Silver Peak's government for protection. We begged them to address Genesis aggression. They ignored us. They told us that we were the problem, that our discomfort with transformation was prejudice requiring correction. So, we exercised our right as sovereign citizens to seek protection elsewhere. We contacted Eastern Sovereignty, a kingdom that still believes in bloodline preservation, in traditional values, in the right of people to remain unchanged. And they answered our plea. The speaker gestured to sovereignty soldiers positioned visibly in the background. These brave men and women are not invaders. They are protectors. They answered our call when our own kingdom abandoned us. And we formally request that the Continental Congress recognize Ashfeld's right to self-determination, to separation from Silver Peak's genesis, imperialism. It was masterful propaganda, casting victims as aggressors, occupation as protection, manufactured crisis as legitimate grievance. And across the continent, kingdoms were watching, forming opinions, deciding whether to support the sovereignty's protective intervention. 20 minutes after the compromised council finished, Ronan had Silver Peak's counter-broadcast ready. Briar appeared first, speaking directly to the camera with exhausted honesty. I've just watched the Ashfield Council broadcast, and I want to address it not with rhetoric, but with the actual residents of Ashfield who are here beside me. She stepped aside, and the camera focused on 32 people, a mix of Genesis and pure bloodline citizens, children and elders, all looking shocked, frightened, and angry. My name is Helena Brightforge, one woman began, her voice shaking but determined. I'm the actual head of Ashfeld's town council. The man who spoke on our broadcast? His name is Corvin Ashwright, brother to one of the pure heritage terrorists currently imprisoned in Silver Peak. He hasn't lived in Ashfield in 5 years. Another resident stepped forward. I'm Marcus, no relation to the Shadow King. I'm a pure bloodline wolf, and I've lived in Ashfield my whole life. The Genesis tyranny they described? It doesn't exist. My neighbor is Genesis-touched. My daughter's best friend transformed 3 years ago. We live together peacefully, respectfully, with occasional disagreements, but never the terror they described. One by one, 32 residents gave testimony. Some Genesis, some pure bloodline. All consistent in their message. Ashfeld was integrated peacefully. The council that requested sovereignty protection was fraudulent, and the town's actual residents wanted no part of foreign occupation. The Eastern sovereignty didn't answer our plea, Helena concluded. They manufactured one. They found traitors willing to lie, gave them our town council's authority, and now they're using our home as justification for invasion. This isn't protection. It's conquest dressed in concern. The broadcast ended, and Briar held her breath waiting for continental response. It came within hours. 8 kingdoms immediately declared support for the Eastern sovereignty, claiming the witnesses were coerced and the extraction was kidnapping rather than rescue. 12 kingdoms expressed skepticism about both narratives, calling for an independent Continental Congress investigation before committing to either side. And 7 kingdoms, including the Western Reaches and Southern Archipelago, issued statements supporting Silver Peak, condemning the Eastern sovereignty's manufacture crisis, and demanding immediate withdrawal from Ashfeld. The Mutual Defense Pact was fracturing. Not broken, but strained. Member kingdoms were calculating whether treaty obligations were worth defending obvious fabrication. It's not enough, Darius assessed after reviewing the responses. 7 supporters isn't sufficient to deter sovereignty. They still have their core coalition, 16 kingdoms committed to supporting their actions regardless of evidence. But it's more than we had yesterday, Ronan countered. Yesterday, neutrality favored sovereignty. Now we've created doubt, made supporting them politically expensive. That's progress. Progress doesn't liberate Ashfeld, Jack said. 500 sovereignty soldiers are occupying our territory, and we're celebrating that some kingdoms question whether the occupation is justified. What would you have us do? Briar asked. Attack? Trigger the war they're trying to provoke. I'd have us recognize that war is already here, Jax replied. They're occupying our territory. They've established a military presence on our land. Calling it protection doesn't change the reality. We're being invaded, and we're responding with broadcasts and diplomatic protests. For now, Kael interjected. But that calculation changes if they advance beyond Ashfeld. Right now, they're testing, seeing if we'll attack to reclaim one town and give them justification for full invasion. If we don't take the bait, if we maintain that Ashfeld is still Silver Peak territory under illegal occupation, we keep the moral and legal high ground. And the residents of Ashfeld? Vesper asked quietly. The actual citizens are still trapped there, living under occupation? What do we tell them? That their freedom matters less than our strategic positioning? It was the question Briar had been avoiding. The 32 residents they'd extracted were safe, but 300 remained in Ashfeld, under sovereignty control, leaving the occupation that would determine continental response. We tell them the truth, Briar said finally. That we're working to liberate them through diplomatic pressure, that military action would trigger a wider war that threatens everyone, that we haven't abandoned them but we're choosing the path most likely to actually free them rather than the path that feels most satisfying. And if that's not enough? Vesper pressed. If they suffer while we pursue diplomatic solutions, then we add their suffering to the weight we already carry, Briar replied. Along with the 12 killed in pure heritage attacks, the 15 who died from the Genesis plague, the thousands of refugees who fled their homes. We add it to the cost of maintaining principles while fighting people who have none. That's a heavy weight, Marcus observed. Leadership is, Briar said simply. If it were easy, if choices were clear, if right actions didn't cost anything, we wouldn't need leaders. We just need administrators following obvious procedures. But reality is complicated, and leadership is navigating complication while trying to minimize harm even when every option causes some. She turned to face the assembled command staff. Eastern sovereignty has occupied Ashfeld. They're waiting for us to attack, so they can trigger their mutual defense pact and invade with legal cover. We're not going to give them that justification. Instead, we continue fortification. We accept refugees from Ashfield who manage to escape. We document every sovereignty abuse, broadcast every testimony, make the occupation as politically expensive as possible. And we wait, not passively but strategically, for the moment when their coalition fractures enough that liberation becomes possible without triggering continental war. How long? Jax asked. I don't know, Briar admitted. Days, weeks, months. However long it takes for international pressure to exceed their ideological commitment. However long it takes for maintaining occupation to cost more than withdrawing. And if that moment never comes, then we'll face that reality when we reach it.
But we're not at that point yet.
We still have diplomatic options and still have time to pursue liberation without war. I won't abandon those options prematurely just because patience is harder than violence. It wasn't the answer Jax wanted. It wasn't the answer any of them wanted. Decisive action, clear victory, the satisfaction of righteous force deployed against obvious wrong. But it was the answer Briar could give while remaining who she was. The Genesis queen who chose difficult restraint over easy aggression, who believed that how you fought mattered as much as what you fought for. Eastern sovereignty occupied Ashfeld. Silver Peak prepared to wait them out. And across the continent, kingdoms watched to see which approach would prevail, patient diplomacy or manufactured crisis. The war was no longer potential. It was here, just wearing diplomatic disguise. And the disguise was becoming increasingly transparent. 20 years after the bridge. The history books would call it the war that wasn't. 20 years after the Ashfield occupation, Briar stood in the Continental Archives, reading accounts of events she'd lived through but barely recognized in academic language. The Ashfield crisis lasted 8 months, the text read, during which Silver Peak maintained diplomatic pressure while the Eastern sovereignty's occupation became increasingly untenable. The Mutual Defense Pact fractured as member kingdoms calculated that supporting obvious aggression cost more than abandoning treaty obligations. Eventually, 16 kingdoms withdrew support, leaving the sovereignty diplomatically isolated and economically strained. They withdrew from Ashfield in a negotiated settlement that saved face while acknowledging defeat. 8 months. The text made it sound simple, inevitable even. It didn't mention the 300 residents who lived under occupation for those months. Didn't describe the diplomatic battles, the economic warfare, the constant pressure to just attack and end it quickly. Didn't capture the exhausting, agonizing daily choice to maintain restraint while people suffered. But it worked. The Eastern sovereignty withdrew. The Mutual Defense Pact collapsed. And while pure heritage continued to exist, they lost state sponsorship, lost resources, eventually diminished to scattered extremist cells rather than existential threat. The final separation bioweapon was never deployed. The laboratory where it was being developed was destroyed, not by Silver Peak forces, but by Genesis manifestors within the Eastern Sovereignty itself, inspired by Silver Peak's example, choosing to act when their government wouldn't. "You look thoughtful," Kael said, joining her in the archives. At 52, he moved with the same fluid grace as always, though silver now threaded his dark hair. "I'm reading about my life written by people who weren't there," Briar replied. "It's strange. They get the facts right but miss the feeling. The fear, the doubt, the constant worry that we were choosing wrong." "Were we?"
Kael asked.
"Choosing wrong. Sometimes," Briar admitted. "The 12 who died in the Pure Heritage attacks, would they have lived if we'd responded more aggressively? The residents of Ashfeld who suffered 8 months of occupation, would they have suffered less if we'd attacked immediately?" "Maybe," Kael said. "Or maybe more people would have died in the war that followed. Maybe the Genesis Plague would have been deployed in retaliation. Maybe the Mutual Defense Pact would have held, and we'd have faced 23 kingdoms instead of breaking their coalition. We'll never know." "That's what makes it hard," Briar said. "Living with choices where you'll never know if the alternative would have been better or worse. Just knowing you made the best decision you could with inadequate information." They walked through the archives together, past records documenting 20 years of gradual transformation. Not the dramatic overnight change Briar had once imagined, but slow, grinding progress punctuated by setbacks and partial victories. Genesis manifestation had spread across the continent. No longer rare or shocking, just part of reality that kingdoms adapted to with varying degrees of grace. Some, like the Northern Wastes, had established integration programs similar to Silver Peak's. Others maintained strict separation but no longer executed manifestors, settling for exile instead of genocide. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't unity. But it was progress. "The 30-year memorial is tomorrow," Kael reminded her. 30 years since you touched the Genesis stone and transformed. They want you to speak." "What do I say?" Briar asked. "What wisdom do I offer after 3 decades of stumbling through impossible choices?" "The truth," Kael suggested. "That transformation is ongoing, that bridges require constant maintenance, that unity isn't a destination but a perpetual journey requiring active choice." "That's not very inspiring." "It's honest," Kael countered. "And honesty is what they need. Not fantasy about how transformation solves problems, but reality about how it creates new ones worth navigating." The memorial ceremony took place in the Grand Plaza, where thousands gathered, Genesis and pure bloodline, young and old, all part of Silver Peak's complicated tapestry. Briar stood before them, looking at faces representing 3 decades of choices, compromises, and hard-won progress. 30 years ago, she began, I believed transformation would solve our divisions. That choosing Genesis abilities would erase the boundaries separating us. I was wrong. Transformation didn't solve divisions. It complicated them, made them more nuanced, harder to categorize. But here's what I learned. Complicated is better than simple, when simple means some people don't get to exist. Nuanced is better than clear when clarity requires erasing those who don't fit neat categories. Messy unity is better than orderly separation when order is purchased through exclusion. She paused, gathering thoughts refined through 3 decades of experience. We're still figuring this out. Still making mistakes, still learning, still navigating tensions between Genesis and pure bloodline communities. Still dealing with those who believe transformation is corruption and those who believe refusing transformation is cowardice. Still balancing individual choice with collective well-being. And that's okay. That's normal. That's what real progress looks like. Not a dramatic revolution that solves everything overnight, but a persistent, exhausting, daily choice to keep trying even when trying is hard. Some of you remember the war that wasn't. 8 months, when we chose diplomatic pressure over military action, when we endured occupation rather than trigger wider conflict. History books say we won. But it didn't feel like winning at the time. It felt like losing slowly enough to eventually outlast those trying to defeat us. That's what transformation requires: willingness to lose slowly, to accept incomplete victories, to celebrate progress that doesn't satisfy anyone completely, but moves everyone forward incrementally. It's unglamorous. It's frustrating. It's the opposite of heroic narratives where good triumphs decisively over evil. But it works. Slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and complications, but it works. We're still here. Still Genesis and pure bloodline together. Still choosing connection over separation. Still building the bridge that everyone said was impossible. She looked across the crowd, seeing Jax, now 44 and leading the Genesis Guard, Vesper heading the Continental Genesis Academy Network, Ronan serving as ambassador to kingdoms still navigating transformation, Marcus living quietly in the northern wastes helping manifestors learn control. All of them aging, changing, carrying scars from choices that cost more than they'd anticipated but yielded results they'd barely dared hope for. So, here's what I want you to remember on this 30th anniversary. The Genesis Bridge isn't finished. It will never be finished. Maintenance is the work. Choosing connection daily, hourly, constantly. That's the actual transformation. Not the dramatic moment when bloodlines mixed, but the persistent choice to keep them mixed despite every reason to retreat to comfortable separation. Thank you for choosing that work. Thank you for 30 years of uncomfortable, complicated, messy progress. Thank you for proving that bridges can hold even when everyone said they'd collapse. And thank you for understanding that the bridge isn't the destination. It's just infrastructure making connections possible for those who choose it. The actual work, building relationships across differences, navigating conflict without abandoning each other, maintaining unity through diversity, that work belongs to all of us forever. The crowd erupted in applause, not universal, never universal, but genuine from those who'd lived the complicated reality she described. That evening, Briar and Kael stood on their private balcony, watching the kingdom settle into the night. The Genesis pillars still glowed across the landscape, permanent fixtures now, no longer miraculous, but simply part of how the world worked. Any regrets?
Kael asked.
Hundreds, Briar admitted. Every person who died while I chose restraint over action. Every refugee who suffered while I pursued diplomatic solutions. Every moment I prioritized principles over people and wondered if I was just dressing up cowardice as wisdom. But I'd make the same choices again, Briar said. Because the alternative, becoming the thing we fought against, abandoning principles to survive, sacrificing what made us worth defending, that would have been worse. We'd have won wars and lost ourselves. That's cold comfort for those who died, Kael observed. Yes, Briar agreed. It is. Leadership is carrying that cold comfort, accepting that some people would be alive if you'd chosen differently, and living with the weight of decisions that will never feel entirely right. Sounds exhausting. It is, Briar confirmed. But it's also the price of trying to build something better. Something that honors both survival and soul. Something worth passing to the next generation who'll face their own impossible choices. Below them, Genesis children and pure bloodline children played together in the plaza, not perfectly integrated, never perfectly, but together. Choosing connection despite differences, building friendships across boundaries that once would have meant war. They'll do better than we did, Kael said, watching them. They're growing up in the world we built. They won't have to discover that unity is possible, they'll just have to maintain it. That's almost harder, Briar said. Maintaining something is less inspiring than creating it. But it's more important. Anyone can build bridges in revolutionary fervor. Keeping them standing through ordinary days. That's the real achievement. She thought about the girl in the dungeon 30 years ago, the one who'd believed herself an abomination, who'd survived through stubborn hope that something better was possible. That girl would recognize who Briar had become. Older, wearier, scarred by 3 decades of impossible choices, but still choosing hope over fear, still building bridges instead of walls, still believing that transformation was worth its complications. And that recognition, more than applause or historical validation or continental peace, was the measure of success that mattered. The Genesis Bridge stood, imperfect, requiring constant maintenance, occasionally strained nearly to breaking, but standing. And tomorrow, Briar would wake up and continue the work, not because it was finished, but because maintenance was the actual transformation, the daily choice to keep building despite everything suggesting retreat would be easier. Forever. And so ends the story of the Genesis Bridge. Not with perfect unity or decisive victory, but with the honest, complicated, unglamorous work of maintaining connection across difference. Because that's what real transformation looks like. Not a dramatic moment, but a persistent choice, repeated daily, forever. Thank you for walking this journey with Briar Nightingale, the Genesis Queen who chose the harder path and proved that bridges can hold, even when everyone says they'll fall.
The end.